This slideshow is on the circulatory system. So first thing we're going to do is talk about blood. One thing to remember is that blood is always red. The shade may differ due to oxygen levels. When blood has lots of oxygen, it's bright red, and when blood has less oxygen in it, it's dark red, but it's always red. So why do veins appear blue? Veins themselves are actually colorless. And when light hits your skin, the light goes through the skin, the fat, blood vessels, and blood. And while this is happening, some wavelengths of light are absorbed by the tissues, while other wavelengths are reflected. And this is why veins appear blue, and it looks like maybe our blood would be blue when it really is not. So it's just kind of an illusion based on color absorption and color reflection. So then if we don't have blue blood, why is some blood colored blue on diagrams? The reason that they do that is so that you can differentiate between different kinds of blood. Diagrams use different colors for blood to easily tell where oxygenated versus deoxygenated blood is found. So in diagrams, we'll see oxygenated blood as red, and we'll see deoxygenated blood as blue. So just some general characteristics about blood. We have a total of between 4 and 6 liters of blood in our body, which makes up about 8% of our body mass. Whole blood can actually be separated into 4 different parts if we put it into a centrifuge. A centrifuge is a machine that spins liquids at a very high speed. And when this happens, the heavier parts will go to the bottom and the lighter parts will float up to the top. So when we centrifuge blood, we can separate out red blood cells. A lot of times they're abbreviated RBC, and the technical term is erythrocytes. We have white blood cells, abbreviated WBC, and the technical name are leukocytes. There are platelets, technical name are thrombocytes, and we have plasma. So this is just showing the process of taking blood, then putting it into a centrifuge. And once it's centrifuged, it's separated into the different components. So you're able to see 3 different parts. The plasma is going to be up on the top. That is a yellowish liquid, and that's about 55% of our blood. There's going to be a middle area that's called the buffy coat, and that will have the leukocytes and the platelets together, and that's usually less than 1% of our blood. And then the bottom will be more of a solid part, and that would be the erythrocytes, and that's about 45% of our blood. So first we'll talk about plasma. Plasma is what causes our blood to be a fluid. And so it is straw colored, and it's 55% of our blood volume. Now the reason our plasma is kind of straw colored or yellow, but our blood is red, is because when all those red blood cells are mixed within the plasma, we see that red appearance of blood. But the plasma itself is actually straw colored. It is almost entirely water. 90% of our plasma is water. The other 10% is stuff that's dissolved in the plasma: gases, nutrients, wastes, hormones, and enzymes. So then everything else in our blood are blood cells, and they're suspended in the plasma. So first, we'll talk about the red blood cells. Remember, these are also called erythrocytes. They make up 45% of our blood volume. And so in 1 milliliter of blood, we have about 5 million red blood cells. This is produced by our red bone marrow. So inside our bones, we have marrow, and that's actually what produces our red blood cells. And in that diagram, you can see the locations of where our red marrow is. So that is where our red blood cells are being produced. Red blood cells live approximately 4 months or about 120 days. And once they start to die, they're then destroyed and recycled by the spleen. Now, our blood is constantly making new red blood cells, and we're constantly recycling red blood cells. So this is a continual process. The job of our red blood cells is to transport oxygen through our body. Red blood cells contain something called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is an iron-containing protein, and this is actually what causes our red blood cells to be red in color. The hemoglobin forces the nuclei and other organelles out of the cell. And so red blood cells are almost entirely filled with hemoglobin. And since the nucleus and other organelles are gone, that's what causes these cells to kind of sink in the middle, and that's called a biconcave shape. And this is also the reason they have a short lifespan, because they don't have a nucleus or those other organelles. So the hemoglobin binds to oxygen in the lungs after we breathe in, and then the red blood cells will travel through your body in the blood, and it'll release that oxygen to the different locations, the different tissues and cells in your body. Next, we'll talk about the white blood cells. Remember, these are called leukocytes. We have very few white blood cells, at least normally we do. These two are produced by the red bone marrow, just like the red blood cells are. So they're going to be produced in the same location. White blood cells are considered normal cells. They have a nucleus, they have all the normal organelles, and they have the ability to live for months to years. There's no hemoglobin in these cells, and that's why they are not red, and that's why we call them white blood cells. Their job is to guard against infection. So our white blood cells, even though they're part of our circulatory system, are also a part of our immune system. And when we're healthy, we have very few white blood cells. We have some that circulate through our body and kind of act like patrols. They're just making sure everything is okay. And then if they encounter an invader, a pathogen, something that can make us sick, then our body starts making more of the white blood cells. And so our number of white blood cells increase when we're fighting an infection. So the diagram on the left is showing a healthy blood sample where we'd only have a few white blood cells. And the sample on the right is showing after an infection when there's many more white blood cells. There's many different types of white blood cells, and each of those different types of white blood cells have a specific function in protecting your body. You're not going to need to know all the different types of white blood cells, but just know that we do have many different kinds, and each has a very specific job. So then the last component of our blood are platelets. And remember, these are called thrombocytes. We usually have about less than 1% of these in our blood. And these, just like the red blood cells and the white blood cells, are also produced by the red bone marrow. Thrombocytes or platelets are actually fragmented cells. They originate from one large cell that's called a megakaryocyte that then breaks into many small pieces. And each of those small pieces are a platelet. A platelet has no nucleus or organelles. It's just cytoplasmic proteins enclosed by a cell membrane. And because they're small, because they don't have a nucleus, because they don't have organelles, they have an extremely short lifespan. They only survive about 8 days. And so our body's continually making more of these. The job of our platelets is blood clotting. And the technical term for blood clotting is called hemostasis. Hemo refers to blood, stasis means to stop. And so when our blood is clotting, platelets will stick to a broken blood vessel. And once they're there, they release clotting factor proteins. And these proteins start to make this net out of fibrin that forms the clot. There are a couple of blood clotting concerns. There is something called a thrombus, and this is a blood clot within a blood vessel. And so this is when the platelets start sticking together, even if there's not a blood vessel that needs to be fixed. Oftentimes, this is due to poor circulation or blood pooling. If your blood isn't circulating properly and it is just kind of sitting there, platelets will start to accumulate and start clotting that sitting blood. And so the dangers of a thrombus is that it can obstruct blood flow because it can start blocking your blood vessels. And there's the danger that it could break loose and start flowing through your body. If the thrombus breaks loose, it's then called an embolus. So an embolus is a freely moving blood clot, often broken loose from a thrombus. And an embolus has the ability, since it's moving, to obstruct blood flow to the heart, lungs, or brain, which could cause death. So we've talked about blood. Now we'll talk about blood vessels, which the blood is moving through. Our blood vessels form a closed circulation pathway. So our blood doesn't just fill our bodies, our blood is always contained within our blood vessels. And there's three types. We have arteries, capillaries, and veins. Now remember we talked about diagrams and the coloration. Arteries are usually going to be colored red. Veins are usually going to be colored blue. And capillaries, oftentimes, we'll see them as purple. So we'll start with the arteries. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. So remember A for arteries, A for away. Arteries have thick, elastic walls. They're able to withstand the pressure from the pumping of the heart. So the heart is pumping with so much force that our arteries need to be able to handle that. If our artery walls were weak, if our blood would pump, if our heart would pump our blood, it could actually burst the artery. Pulse points are locations where arteries pass close to the skin, and you're able to feel the arteries expand with blood every time the heart pumps. So when you're feeling your pulse, what you're actually feeling is an artery that is expanding every time blood is pumping through it. So here you can see the main pulse points in our body. And then in that video, you're able, if you look really closely, you can actually see the expansion of the radial artery. So if you look closely, sometimes you're able to actually see the arteries expanding even through your skin. Arteries get smaller and smaller the further away from the heart they are. The aorta is the largest artery in the body, and that is the artery that comes directly off of the heart. And then arterioles are the smallest arteries. Arteries usually carry oxygen-rich blood. There's one exception. There are pulmonary arteries that carry oxygen-poor blood away from the heart to the lungs. So pulmonary means lung. Artery always goes away from the heart. So the pulmonary arteries are carrying oxygen-poor blood to the lungs so that it's able to pick up oxygen to eventually go to the rest of the body. Next, veins. Veins always carry blood toward the heart. Veins have less pressure due to greater distance from the pumping of the heart. So if you think of your circulation like a circle pathway in your body starting and ending at the heart is going to pump the blood into the arteries. And then when the blood is eventually going to come back to the heart through the veins don't have as much pressure as the arteries. And because of that, veins have thin walls and they have a larger diameter than arteries, because if we have a larger diameter, more blood can flow more quickly. Veins also have valves. Valves ensure the correct direction of blood flow. And that's because veins have a greater distance from the pressure waves of the heart. Plus, we have gravity. So think about all the blood that's in your toes right now. That blood has to get back up to your heart and it has to go against gravity. So every time your heart pumps, that blood is going to move up your leg a little bit, but in between pumps, it could trickle right back down to your toes. So to make sure that doesn't happen, your veins have valves. So every time the blood gets pumped, it moves up your leg a little bit and then a valve closes. So it can't go back down. And then the next time your heart pumps, it goes further up your leg. And then another valve will close to make sure that the blood's always going in the right direction. Now, sometimes the valves can have some problems. And that's when, for example, the valves don't close properly. That is what leads to something called varicose veins. So if there's something wrong with the valves in the veins, it results in backflow of blood. The blood pools in the veins, and it can actually cause the veins to start expanding and actually kind of getting abnormally shaped because of that. And so here's some examples of varicose veins. These are really common in legs, and they're more common as you age. So the further away from the heart, the veins are smaller. The vena cava is the largest vein in the body. The vena cava is attached right to the heart, and venules are the smallest veins. So they're going to be the furthest away from the heart. Veins will usually carry oxygen-poor blood. Now, these also have one exception, and that would be the pulmonary veins. Remember, pulmonary means lung. Vein means that we're going to the heart. And so the pulmonary veins are carrying oxygen-rich blood towards the heart from the lungs. So eventually the heart is then going to be able to pump that oxygen-rich blood to the rest of the body. The third type of blood vessel are capillaries. Capillaries are responsible for the exchange between cells and the blood of gases, nutrients, and wastes. These blood vessels have the smallest diameter. The diameter is only about 1 cell thick. And so these capillaries will diverge off of the arterioles, and then they'll converge back into the venules. There's something called capillary refill time, and this is the time for color to return to a capillary bed after pressure is applied to cause loss of color. Normal capillary refill time is 3 seconds. So you can test this just by pushing on your skin in some location. Usually it's done somewhere on the hand, and you'll notice that you have a lighter spot and then it eventually recolors. And that's the blood going back to the spot that you were pushing the blood out of. Capillary refill time can vary. It can be influenced by temperature, age, gender, and lighting conditions. Some blood vessel conditions and concerns. One is called atherosclerosis. This is a slow, progressive disease. Usually we hear about this in older individuals, but since it's a slow, progressive disease, it can begin as early as childhood. And this is when there's a buildup of something called plaque on the artery walls. Plaque is a combination of fat, cholesterol, and other substances. It could be caused by high blood pressure, high cholesterol and fat in the diet, tobacco use, obesity, diabetes. Complications of atherosclerosis is that plaque could restrict blood flow. It could damage the inner artery walls, and the plaque could actually burst and it could trigger a blood clot. So then we could have a thrombus, which could progress to an embolus. It can lead to poor circulation, tissue death because it's not allowing the tissues to get oxygen, heart attack or heart failure, stroke, aneurysms, and chronic kidney disease. One kind of treatment for atherosclerosis is something called balloon angioplasty. And what that is they actually insert a catheter into a blood vessel that is starting to be blocked, and then they inflate a balloon that's on the catheter, and it helps to widen the artery. An aneurysm is another blood vessel condition. An aneurysm is an enlargement of a section of an artery that's caused by a weakened artery wall. This is most common in the brain, the aorta, the back of the knee, the intestine, and the spleen, although it could happen to any artery. The scary thing about aneurysms is that there's often no symptoms until it ruptures. And when an aneurysm ruptures, it can cause massive internal bleeding, it could cause a stroke, and it can even cause death. There are different methods of preventing rupture. So if an aneurysm is found, we could do a process called clipping, coiling, stenting, or a combination of coiling and stenting. And here's examples of those different processes. Last in the circulatory system, and probably the most important, is the heart. The size of our heart is about the size of your fist, and it weighs less than a pound. We always think of our heart as being towards the left, and it is, but it's only slightly to the left. It's not way over to the left like oftentimes we think. And the activity of our heart is that it beats approximately 72 times a minute. And our pulse, like we talked about earlier, is a measure of our heart activity. Our pulse is how many times our heart is actually pumping. The myocardium is what we actually call the heart muscle, and it's composed of special cells that are called cardiac muscle cells. The pericardium is a protective tissue that's around the heart. The septum is a muscular wall inside the heart that divides the heart into left and right sides. The right and left sides of the heart do completely different jobs. And so there's no mixing between the right and the left sides of the heart. The heart has 4 chambers or 4 hollow sections. 2 of the chambers are called atria. These are the upper chambers of the heart, and the atria always receive blood from the body. The other 2 chambers are called ventricles. These are the 2 lower chambers, and the job of the ventricles is to pump blood to the body. Our heart also has valves, kind of like our veins. The valves are flaps of tissue that prevent the blood from flowing backwards. And so in this animation, you can see the 4 valves They open and close at different times to make sure that the blood is always going in the correct direction. We have 4 different valves. The tricuspid is between the right atrium and the ventricle. The pulmonary valve is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary arteries. The bicuspid or mitral valve is between the left atrium and ventricle. And the aortic valve is between the left ventricle and the aorta. The sounds that we hear when our heart is pumping is due to the closing of the valves. So the first sound that we hear when our heart is pumping, like when you're listening with a stethoscope, they call it the lub sound. That's when the tricuspid and the mitral valves close. The second sound, the dub sound, is when the aortic and the pulmonary valves close. Heart auscultation sounds like some big fancy thing. This is just the procedure of listening to heart sounds with a stethoscope. And doctors are trained to be able to listen and be able to hear each of the 4 valves separately. So if you think of the last time you went to the doctor and they were using the stethoscope on your chest, you'll notice that they move it around. They don't just leave it in one spot. They usually move it around to 4 different places. And when they do that, they're trying to listen to your 4 different valves. Now, when they use the stethoscope on your back, they're not listening for your heart. When they use the stethoscope on your back, they're actually listening for your lungs. A heart murmur is detected when listening with the stethoscope. And this is when there's some abnormal heart sounds. And that usually means that there's a leaky valve. That means the valve isn't closing the right way. And when that happens, we start having backflow of blood and inefficient circulation. The valves could be thickened or they could just be weak. And so the valves may require replacement. Artificial valves are manufactured by different medical device companies, like Medtronic, for example, produces artificial valves. There's also biological valves that are most often derived from pigs, cows, or horses. Human cadaver valves are rare, and that's because usually if we have a cadaver heart, that entire heart is going to usually be used for a transplant rather than just taking the valves out of the heart. So that's why oftentimes artificial valves are used or biological valves from pigs, cows, or horses. So the heart is a double pump. And like I said before, the septum divides the right and left sides of the heart. So they're doing completely different jobs. So pulmonary circulation is controlled by the right side of the heart. It pumps oxygen-poor blood to the lungs. Systemic circulation is controlled by the left side of the heart, and it pumps oxygen-rich blood to the body. This animation is really helpful when you're trying to remember the pathway of blood flow through the heart. So this is something that you can refer back to help you with that. This as well is another really good animation to help you remember the blood flow through the heart. So then we have coronary circulation. The heart needs its own circulation. It can't just rely on blood flowing in and out. So coronary circulation is actually a third circulation pathway in addition to pulmonary and systemic circulation. This is circulation from the heart to the heart and back to the heart. So basically what's happening is blood is being supplied to the myocardium, to the cardiac muscle cells. Even though blood is flowing through the heart all the time as the heart is pumping, the myocardium is too thick for diffusion to supply the heart with oxygen and nutrients and to get rid of waste. So we can't just assume that blood is going to be able to diffuse through the tissues. It needs its own circulation. The heart itself is approximately 1/200th of the mass of the body, but it requires about 1/20th of the body's blood supply. And that's because it needs more oxygen to function than any other organ in your body except for the brain. And the left side of the heart, especially the left ventricle, gets the most blood of any of the chambers. And that's because the left side is stronger and works harder than the other chambers, because the left ventricle needs to be strong enough to pump blood to the entire body. So even though the right ventricle is a pumping chamber, the right ventricle is only pumping blood to the lungs, which are right next door. And so the right ventricle doesn't need as much force, whereas the left ventricle has to make sure blood gets to every single part of your body. So coronary arteries branch off of the aorta and supply oxygenated blood to all parts of the heart. Cardiac veins are what takes deoxygenated blood from the myocardium and it collects back in the right atrium. So here's the pathway of blood flow through the body. This is something you're going to need to know. So make sure you use this to help you study that. This is that same information, but it's showing you the pulmonary circulation part, and it's also showing you the systemic circulation part. So then we have a structure called the sinoatrial node, or sometimes called the SA node. And this is your pacemaker of your heart. It's a small group of muscles that are in the right atrium, and it coordinates the pumping of all four chambers. So the SA node is responsible for you having a normal heart rhythm. It makes sure that the ventricles contract 1/10 of a second after the atria, and this ensures that the ventricles have fully filled before they contract and pump blood to another location. The SA node does not need to be connected to the nervous system. It's able to cause the heart to beat on its own outside of the body. There's something called the inherent rate. The inherent rate is the rate at which the sinoatrial node normally generates impulses. So on its own, the SA node wants the heart to beat at about 100 beats per minute. But when connected to the brain, the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the nervous system that kind of slows everything down, slows our heartbeat to about 72 beats per minute resting. Now, a cardiac pacemaker is a battery-operated device that regulates the electrical conduction system of the heart. So if the SA node is not working properly, then an individual might need a pacemaker inserted. The pacemaker can sense when the heart is beating irregularly or too slowly. It then generates electrical impulses, and it causes the heart to beat how it's supposed to. There's electrodes that are placed within the heart that transmit impulses that make the chambers contract at the correct pace. Blood pressure is the force of blood on the walls of the arteries. It's measured with a sphygmomanometer. That's just the fancy name for a blood pressure cuff. And the units that it's measured in is mmHg, which stands for millimeters of mercury. So remember, we've already talked about how arteries have to be able to withstand the pressure from the heart. A measure of that pressure is called blood pressure. So to measure blood pressure, the blood pressure cuff or sphygmomanometer is inflated on the arm until the brachial artery is closed off. So when they squeeze that cuff, it's actually causing so much pressure that it blocks an artery. And then when they listen with a stethoscope, no sound can be heard. So they know they've pumped up the cuff enough. When the pressure valve is released, the cuff deflates and blood begins to flow back through the artery. As blood enters the artery, when they're listening with the stethoscope, tapping sounds can be heard. The first time they hear a tapping sound, they look at the measurement, and that's called the systolic pressure. And that's the pressure when your heart is contracting. So that's a larger number. The last time they hear a tapping sound is the diastolic pressure. And that's when the heart is relaxing or in between pumps. And normal blood pressure is about 120/80, systolic over diastolic. Hypertension is when an individual has chronically high blood pressure. And this is starting to be a concern if someone's blood pressure is regularly 130/80 or above. Now, normal blood pressure is always going to be higher or lower depending on your activity, your body temperature, your mood. But if it is chronically or high all the time, that's a cause for concern. So there's lots of different risk factors that can contribute to high blood pressure. Some we can control and others we can't. So as you get older, there's a higher risk. There is a higher percentage of individuals of African heritage that have high blood pressure. It is genetic, so it runs in families. If you're overweight or obese, that extra weight and extra blood in the body causes more pressure. If you're not physically active, your heart is working harder and can cause more force on the arteries. Tobacco use narrows and weakens artery walls. And too much salt or sodium in your diet that causes you to retain fluid and can increase your blood pressure. If you don't have enough potassium in your diet, that can cause it. Drinking alcohol, which damages the heart. Stress, and then some other chronic conditions. Kidney disease, diabetes, sleep apnea, and also there is a risk of high blood pressure during pregnancy. Some effects of high blood pressure on the body: it could burst blood vessels, it could cause kidney failure, heart attack, and stroke. One reason that we oftentimes see kidney failure as one of these risks or warning signs with different conditions is that if your kidneys start to fail, that means that your other organs are probably going to start failing. So kidney failure is a sign that the rest of the body could be following. Coronary bypass surgery, also called coronary artery bypass graft or cabbage surgery, redirects blood flow around a blocked coronary artery. And so if you've heard of people having a single bypass, a double bypass, a triple bypass, or a quadruple bypass, that's how many different places they had to bypass to get the blood to flow properly. A heart attack is also called a myocardial infarction. It occurs when the flow of blood to the heart is blocked. Interrupted blood flow can cause cell tissue death, and it results in irreversible heart damage. Our heart cells cannot do mitosis. So if we have heart cells that have been damaged, there's no way to fix those. There's no way to get new heart cells. And so that damage, those cells that have died, is permanent.